South Africa's official unemployment rate jumped to 29% in the second quarter of the year, the highest jobless rate since the start of 2008. The unemployment figures were published by SABC yesterday. Today, statistics on poverty in South Africa have also been released. But to talk to us more about these, I have in studio with me now Sacha Knox from the Studies in Poverty and Inequality Institute. Good afternoon to you. Thank you so much for coming through.
Thank you so much for having me.
Now, obviously, some bad news yesterday with the unemployment rate, and we were actually having this conversation that this surely means that if the unemployment rate goes up, the poverty line is also affected.
So I think it's really important to look at how South Africa measures poverty. We have three official poverty lines. The lowest of those is called the food poverty line, and that measures the cost of the minimal amount of food that's required in order to survive. That amount is currently set, according to today's released information, at 561 Rand.
So that's per person per month.
Exactly.
Yeah.
An incredibly meager amount. The second poverty line is called the lower bound poverty line, and that's the cost of the food in the food poverty line, as well as the average cost of non-food items spent by people within the food poverty line expenditure bracket, if that makes sense.
It does.
That's 810 Rand. And the upper bound poverty line is the food poverty line and the average non-food expenditure of households around the lower bound poverty line. And that figure is currently at 1,227 Rand. So, I mean, I think we can kind of immediately see that these levels are set incredibly low, and there's a little bit of a sordid history in terms of South Africa's poverty lines. We had in 1941 something called the poverty datum line, and this basically set the standards for optimal exploitation of black workers within the apartheid state. So when we are looking at poverty lines, I think we really need to be aware that they are political in nature. They reflect the visions and the aspirations that we want to see embodied in the society. And also from a practical perspective, when we have standards, then it means policymakers are able to design policies aligned to meet those standards. So if we
But the implementation thereof, because I know a lot of people are of the view that we've got these beautiful policies on a piece of paper, but the question is, are they really being implemented? We've got the National Development Plan where there are time frames and targets that have been set for the alleviation of poverty itself. Are we working anywhere near those time frames?
Well, you know, I think that you're right. We have both rights within South Africa, but also international rights in some of the covenants that we are treaty to. And I think that if we take seriously the right to dignity, we really need to assess where these lines are setting the bar or the standard. So the National Development Plan is incredibly important, and we had a goal set to ensure that all South Africans were lifted above the lower bound poverty line by 2030. But unfortunately, in the SONA, which was recently aired, the goalpost of that shifted to the lowest poverty line, to the food poverty line. So that's a little bit concerning and something that we need to monitor. I mean, South Africa is the most unequal country in the world, both in terms of income and in terms of wealth poverty. And we see things like the child support grant, for example, being set at 420 Rand. So that's 23% below the food poverty line, and 29% below the cost to secure a basic nutritious diet. So this is incredibly concerning. I mean, we have to realize the reality of poverty and inequality in this country. It's a desperate issue. Our stunting levels in children under 5 go up to 30%.
Yeah.
And that means that children don't have the basic nutrition in order to develop.
So you bring up an important point here of inequality. I think just yesterday I was going through your website and came across quite an interesting issue around inequality. The poverty line between the males and the females differ completely. If you were to compare the poverty line of a woman, it totally differs from that of men. So as I say, this still talks to the inequalities that we still find in South Africa?
Yes, definitely. I mean, you spoke to the quarterly labour force survey results that were released yesterday with unemployment rising to 29%. I think what's important to realise is as shocking as that statistic is, it's not actually the entire picture. When we look at the expanded unemployment rates, which considers the unemployed as well as discouraged work seekers. So those are work seekers no longer actively seeking employment. The rate is at 38.5%.
It's a huge number.
It's a huge amount. And unemployment amongst black South Africans is at 43%. So, you know, the realities of this country in terms of addressing some of the injustices of the past really need to be carefully considered. And yeah, like I was saying, we really need to take it seriously. Because I don't think enough change has actually happened. If we're looking at some of the statistics in terms of the poverty line, 55.5% of South Africans are living below the upper bound poverty line. 25.5% of South Africans are living below the food poverty line. Yeah, that means that almost a quarter of the population cannot feed themselves
afford a proper
basic
meal.
Nutrition, basic nutrition. So, yeah, and I mean, the statistics for black South Africans are 64.2% are living below the upper bound poverty line. So, yeah, we really need to, I mean, what these figures do is hopefully make real some of the realities that people face in this country.
Indeed.
Where people are not afforded a life of dignity.
And I know your institute really hosts a number of public seminars. You engage in social dialogue through your community constituency at Netlick. What conversations are being heard at that level? Are they even discussing these issues?
I mean, I think there are a number of ways that we need to look to address some of these problems of inequality. I think when you have rising unemployment as we do, with a complete lack of any social security for those aged 18 to 59, you are going to continue to see inequality increasing. So, you know, I think another important thing to realize about our unemployment is that 70% of our unemployed are long-term unemployed. So that means that after they've stopped seeking work and after a year, the chances of employment become incredibly low. So the kind of unemployment that we're looking in South Africa is structural and it's intractable unemployment. So I think when you are looking at transitory unemployment, measures like the Unemployment Insurance Fund can potentially address transitory unemployment. But when we are seeing unemployment that is so structural and intractable, we need an alternative safety net for income. So we really advocate for a basic income grant.
I wanted to say that your UIF is not a permanent, really a thing that one can depend on.
Exactly. And I mean, I think that it's important to start seeing Social Security as a fiscal stimulus package in a way, because when people have spending power, they can contribute to the economy. So we're not talking about handouts, we're actually talking about a fiscal stimulus package when we're talking about Social Security packages. And yeah, the fact that so many people are missed by our current Social Security system is really, I think, unforgivable when we are looking at the ways that the injustices of the past have not been addressed.
All right. So we'll leave it at this. Thank you so much for coming through. But obviously, government really has to do something regarding this particular situation.
Sure. Thank you, Palesa.
Sacha Knox from the Studies in Poverty and Inequality Institute talking to us about the poverty line numbers that have just been released.